Okay, as I said, and we'll go through the requirements for group work first, and then we'll do the demonstration. So this is the last group work now, and which is due next week. That means you need to present in the lab next week. And the requirements in the module handbook. So as you can see, and can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, that's good to know. So that's the coursework 3, and we have this group task. And so essentially the task is practicing what we have been covered in the lecture so far after the last coursework. So there are two main parts, and the first part is to make the front end of your after-school lesson app, a progressive web app, or PWA for short. So that's the first part. And the second part is to refactor the front end of the after-school lesson app with a single file components. And so both is about the front end of the after-school lesson app. So you can use the one you built for coursework 1 or coursework 2, and those two I assume will be quite similar. Maybe coursework 2 will be a little bit more advanced with connections to the database backend. But either will be fine because none of the requirement is related to backend. And so the first part is about making the front end PWA. And also, both of these needs to be done in the same app. So you can make an app both a PWA and has component. It's not expected you make two versions. One version is a PWA, the other one has components. You can easily do both in the same app. And so for the PWA, and it's mostly covered in the week. Let me get the week correct. Yeah, so that's week 16, and covered everything you need to know about the progressive web app. And so there are 4 requirements you need to do, and one of them, which the only one that is not mentioned here, is you need to host it on a server which providing HTTPS connection, so which you can do easily by using the GitHub pages. So if you probably already using GitHub pages to show your front-end code, so long as you just push the new updates to that same repository, and that will be fine. Okay, and someone is asking about Heroku. I think the Heroku also does HTTPS. Let me just check if I. So, okay, any of these? So I'm testing if the Heroku supports HTTPS. Okay, and yeah, so it is. So you can see, and there's this lock icon at the beginning. That means it's HTTPS. Also, if you click, it will expand. It shows you HTTPS. So that will be fine as well. Okay, and back to the requirements. Okay, so that's will be done quite easily once you put onto the GitHub pages or Heroku. And the other 3 things you need to do, making changes to your code. So first, you need to create a web manifest file. This is similar to the package.json file for a node project. So this web manifest file contains everything you need for a PWA. So here, there are many different things you can set. So here, we mentioned a few that we covered in the lecture. The name of your app, a shorter name, which will be used as a name when you add the app to the home screen on your phone. An icon is for the same purpose when you're adding the app to the home screen of phone, it needs a picture, and that's what the icon file is for. And starting URL, and to tell the PWA which is the file to start or the main file to run when you're starting the process, and something similar to say the start script in your package.json file. It tells the JSON how to start a project. And finally, the background color. So that's, say, when you started the app on the phone, it will show a splash screen, which you can set the color to, and the color of your choice. Okay, and so that's the web manifest file. And to just have a look of the lecture, which will give you the examples. Yeah, and you need an actual icon image. So here you need to set as the name or even the path of the file if it's not the same folder. And here you need to actually have an image, which here the path or the name can refer to. Okay, so these two are relatively easy. And this is the part which you'll need a little bit code, but not that much. It's about service worker. So it will have two things the service worker needs to do. And the first one is cache all the files needed to run the app offline. So this way, it will allow the app to run when there's no internet connection. And you can do this in two ways. First, you can create a list of all the files that's needed to run locally, or you can set it up so it will automatically cache the files if it's not already cached. We covered the both in the lecture. So, and making a list of files can be a little bit tedious and sometimes, and you might miss. And so you could use both, which is what we did in the lecture example. And here you need to capture or cache all the static files, in the sense HTML, CSS, and even the vue.js file, which is needed to run the front end. And then certain things, for example, the connections to the backend, that cannot be cached. For example, if you need to submit an order, it requires interaction with the backend server. That would not be possible to be cached locally. So those that cannot be. So those parts of the app will not be able to run when there's no internet connection. But this is the same for native apps as well. For example, if an app requires, say, an iPhone app or Android app requires connection to server to run, then if there's no connection, it still not be able to run. Okay, and then, so once you cache all the files, and the second thing that service work can do is to use the local cache the files instead of retrieving from server when the device is offline. Actually, this works when device is online as well. Essentially, when the device is offline, there's no internet connection, you have to use the cache the files, otherwise the app won't work. And when you are online, there's still benefit of using the cache the files because it will be faster than retrieving the files from the server. Okay, and so there's 1 point for each. So in total, 4 points. Actually, 2 points for the service worker, and the other two have 1 point each because they are relatively simple. Is there any questions about the PWA part? No. Okay, and so I'm going to move on to the next part. So the one is about refactoring the front end of your after-school app with a single file component. So the refactoring here means improve your code, but it does not change its behavior or functions. So from the user's perspective, nothing really changed. It's still the same. But if you look at the code, it may be better structured and divided or separated into different files, or improved efficiency so it runs faster, etc. So that's what the refactor here means. And the way we're going to mostly focus on is to create components or break one large files into smaller components and make it, say, more manageable. Usually when the file gets really long, it's made difficult to read and change and update. And also by creating components, abstract away or separate some of the code, make it possible to reuse certain code. So if you want to use the same component multiple times, you just have to call them rather than have to repeat the code. And we're going to be using single file component. And we started on single file component and in the lecture last week, and we didn't quite finish yet. So there's a few more slides from last week we didn't cover because we ran out of time. And these are what required here. But so, and definitely by after this week's lecture, you definitely should know how to do all these. Even haven't covered all of them yet, and so far in the lecture. So, and in that sense, and the lecture you need to look at this will be the week 17, which is talk about the component in general. So in Vue, it's possible to make components without making that a single file component. And obviously week 18, which is last week, we started on a single file component. And we will also have example of converting the pet store example we have been using so far in the lecture into a few single file component files. So that is something we'll finish this week in the lecture. Okay, and so here are the requirements. So there should be at least 2 child components. In a sense, the root Vue instance will be the root component or will be the parent of the other component you're going to use. So these we'll have at least 2. If you want to have more, then that's fine. So child components and one for the lesson list. So that lists all the lessons. In the example we have in the lecture will be the list of the products. And the other one is for the shopping cart and checkout. So that's what will be the checkout forms. Okay. So currently we have this button on the app, which you can switch between these two. So you can click checkout and goes to the checkout page and click it again, goes back to the lesson list. Now we can just make those 2 parts into 2 components. Okay, and the lesson list component emits a custom event every time a lesson is added to the cart. So the parent component can update the cart. Okay, and so this is one of the kind of like the price you have to pay, extra little bit complexity when you're using component. So in the lesson list component, each lesson should have, say, an add cart button. When it's pressed, that lesson should be added to the shopping cart. Usually it's an array. That's how we do it so far. Now, the shopping cart array would be still stored in the parent component. And when the lesson list component, which is a child component, wants to make changes to the parent array or the cart array, which is in the parent, it should not do so directly. So you should always avoid changing the data from the parent component. Instead, you should send an event or emit a custom event to tell the parent component, say, this lesson has been added to cart, and then the parent component will then update the cart to do that. Okay, and so I believe it's in week 17 when we talk about the component, we talk about how to do this custom event. Okay, and then we have the checkout component, which is the second component, and it should use props to receive the lessons in the cart. Okay, and this is another way to communicate or passing data between the parent and children, so that the checkout component needs to know the list of lessons being added to the array, the cart array, and that cart array, as we said before, is stored in the parent. And then it needs that information to display the shopping cart, and then that information it will get from its props. And then when the component is called, the parent will pass the shopping cart through the props, using the props to this child component. And then similarly, when the user removing a lesson from the cart, and then that card, it needs to be updated. Again, this should be done by the parent, whereas the component itself, the checkout card component, will just send the event to the parent to say this lesson has been removed from the card. Okay, and that's all about the single file component. And is there any question? Okay, and okay, and if there's no question, we're gonna stop there now and start the demonstration.